Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, the podcast about women and women first. I'm Sovereign Syre, a writer, comedian, and most recently have returned to my natural hair color, which is blonde.
The prodigal daughter returned to blonde. Welcome back.
Back in the saddle, baby. with all the street harassment that comes along with it, and it is a lot.
You missed it, didn't you?
How
can I inflict more men on my day?
Yeah, that is,
Good luck.
Yeah, it's really so awesome.
I love it for us and for you. I'm Ella Darling, a VR pioneer, a former librarian, an adult film performer, and a figment of your imagination. Now, we here at Ill Repute support women's rights.
But more importantly, we support women's wrongs.
And which woman's wrongs are we righting today?
I'm not sure. And you'll see why in a minute. But today, we're doing the final installment in our little series on Miss Buffy Sainte Marie.
Yes, we already have gotten quite a bit of engagement on episode 1, which, as we record this on the day of our Lord, the 22nd of February, 2024, is mere days after it dropped. We've gotten a lot of people talking, and I gotta say, I paid for my whole seat, but I'm only using the edge. Sovereign, deliver me from this pain of cliffhanger. Pull me off this hanging cliff.
So last week, we profiled an icon, Buffy Sainte Marie, Indigenous icon. We listened to a sampling of her oeuvre. We gushed over her look. We gushed over her songs. We gushed over her just fabulousness. And we ended with, that there was a documentary called Carry It On that was published by PBS in 2022. And it was meant as sort of a document of her entire career, like the crown jewel on a career that was full of awards and praise and
accolades galore.
Yeah. And it was her getting her flowers. Like, here are your flowers, ma'am. And one person watching that documentary felt a little uncomfortable. And that brings us to part 2 of our 2-parter on Buffy Sainte Marie. The Big Ones Get Away. In 2022, PBS released the documentary Carry It On about Buffy Sainte Marie's life. Jacqueline Keeler, a journalist, sat down to watch it and found herself uneasy as the documentary progressed. Something about Buffy's adoption story didn't add up for Keeler. Buffy had never found her real parents. So Keeler started digging and found what she considered damning evidence that Buffy Sainte Marie had fabricated her identity for the last 60 years, a live birth certificate.
Okay, before we get too far here, for those who don't know, what is the significance of a live birth certificate versus a birth certificate, as one might think of it, versus what else might have come up in looking for documentation? Like, what would somebody who supported and believed Buffy's story expect to find, if not a live birth certificate? Can you just shine a light on all that?
I'm not an expert. I don't know if this varies state to state, but generally what happens in an adoption is that a new birth certificate is made and the adoptive parents' names are put in place of the birth parents' names. Now, the original copy of that birth certificate is generally sealed by the court and stored somewhere.
Okay.
But I'll get into that in a second. But what Jacqueline Keeler found was Buffy listed on simply like a live birth registry, like her name was there. And that would be when a baby is born, whether they're going to be adopted or whether they're going to stay with their birth parents, A live birth is documented.
So it's the registry of the birth itself, not a birth certificate can be generated or changed after infancy, but the registry and the documentation and the relevance of this particular live birth certificate was to certify this baby was had by parents in this hospital.
Yes.
It was as we can see, the 49th infant born that day.
Yes. Or that year. That year.
Oh, that year. Yeah. I forget. It's a lot slower back then. But okay, so the significance here, if you don't know, and I didn't until we started having these discussions, is that they found a birth certificate that makes it clear to whom she was born, where she was born, and it answers a lot of questions that I thought she didn't know the answers to.
Yes. So there's a copy of the birth certificate here. It has a sequence number, 49, which means she was the 49th baby born that year at that hospital or in that city. When a birth certificate is submitted to the office that holds the records, they sequence that birth certificate. Now, the parents listed on the birth certificate are Albert Santa Maria and Winifred Irene Kenrick. And it says on there, everyone is listed as white. And yeah. And it's signed by the doctor who witnessed the live birth. And it's dated February 20th, 1941.
Mm-hmm.
And then it is got the Stoneham Town Hall seal on it. And it's signed by Maria Sagarino, who is the town clerk.
And that is actually, that's because this is a certified copy of the birth certificate. This was generated in December of 2022, it looks like. Mm-hmm. And so that's why there's the Stoneham Town seal on it, just in case anyone's like, but they wouldn't have that in the 40s, just for clarity. Okay, so that's quite something.
Yeah. So Keeler passed the information on to the CBC. And in October of 2023, the Fifth Estate, an investigative news program at the CBC, released an expose.
On this edition of The Fifth Estate, a Canadian icon whose true identity is in doubt.
I don't understand how in the face of all of those details, you continue to tell a story that has no basis in reality. I don't get it.
For the past couple of years, I've been investigating so-called pretendians, people who falsely pass themselves off as Indigenous.
What's happening really is that they're taking that opportunity from a real Indigenous person.
Nearly 1 year ago, I got a surprising tip about a famous musician.
Here's Canadian legend
Buffy Sainte Marie.
That's quite the hot seat.
Yeah.
And we've got Dr. Talbert right up front there, just asking the questions that beg to be asked, frankly.
Yes.
According to Buffy Sainte Marie, she never had a birth certificate. It should be said, she meant she didn't have a real birth certificate. It is standard practice with adoptions to change the birth parents on the birth certificate, and the original is sealed by the courts or available when the adoptee turns 18, depending on when and where the adoption took place. This is supported by the testimony of a Cree lawyer whom Buffy hired in the 70s to help her find her birth parents with the hopes of getting citizenship in Canada and status under the Indian Act. From a statement by the National 60s Scoop Healing Foundation.
The foundation accepts the affidavit of Delia Opakokyu of Canoe Lake Cree Nation, who is a nationally respected and widely known senior Indigenous lawyer. Ms. Opakokyu was legal counsel for Buffy Sainte Marie at the time she sought to investigate her Indigenous ancestry. Paragraphs 25 and excerpts of her May 27, 1980 letter to the CBC as found in the October 25th, 2023 affidavit state in part. In general, it is difficult to prove Indian births prior to 1944. The majority of Indian mothers, until the past 20 years, had their children at home and did not register them unless there was a practical reason to do so.
In Ms. Sainte Marie's case, It was practiced for the community to encourage single mothers to give up their children for adoption. Indian people were generally outside the system and were unaware of the requirements of such matters as the formal adoption process. It would appear from the evidence available that Ms. Sainte Marie was given up for adoption without any written records having been kept. And then it goes on. There are many instances of people having knowledge of Ms. Sainte Marie's history. Her mother, an unmarried woman, was from the Piapot Indian Reserve and had Buffy at Carvin, Saskatchewan, in a private home, and eventually gave her up for adoption to a couple who were in the area at the time. Her background is not exceptional in a culture whose people have always recorded their past orally, it says. And now we've got a YouTube clip here.
Watching that documentary that aired on PBS, she became suspicious about Buffy's origin story.
I was waiting for that moment where she's done the research, she's found the records, but there was never any mention of her actually finding her family.
There is a reason why the story lacked specific detail. According to the two authorized biographies about her life, she had no birth certificate, says one. There's no official record of Buffy Sainte Marie's birth, says the other. Both books suggest record keeping at the time was poor and documents could have been destroyed. But in a statement to the Fifth Estate, the Saskatchewan government said that it was unaware of any records destroyed by fire or flood or missing for any other reason. Tallbear says this is a common narrative pretendians lean on.
You see the same patterns in these stories. Documents were lost. In fact, Native people are extremely well documented. We have to be well documented so the settler state can manage, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, so it can manage land allotments, so it could manage residential schools. And remember, it was trying to control us, corral us, put us into institutions, and assimilate us.
After watching that documentary on Buffy Sainte Marie's life, Keeler says she started to dig.
And the first thing I found was her on the Massachusetts birth index. That was shocking because that meant that she was born in Massachusetts. She wasn't born in Saskatchewan. And so then I spoke to another researcher.
It was such a shock.
I love Dr. Tallbear coming in hot. She's gonna get settler colonial state in there. I love that.
An icon.
Iconic.
An absolute icon.
Iconic.
Yeah. A gift. I'm already with Jacqueline Keeler.
Yeah.
I love that she just saw a documentary, was kind of, feeling a kind of way that she didn't get to know who her parents were. And so she figured out more than the documentarians with a budget figured out in their entire production. She did a web search. She did a quick web search and everything came falling down, which really begs the question, why didn't anybody else?
Exactly. My thoughts exactly. How the heck, I don't know why I'm not saying, but how the heck do you have 2 biographies and 2 documentaries made about your life with ostensibly researchers and writers? And these were written in a post-ancestry.com, post-newspapers.com environment. Let's
take a step further, because it's not just the writers and researchers. I want, Sovereign, you work in film production. When there's documentaries, somebody interviewed me about the AI tools I use as a cam girl and on OnlyFans, and they had me screenshot the number of followers I actually have on OnlyFans because they wanted to make sure they were doing their due diligence. How did an entire, 2 documentary crews, they've got so many people looking into this shit.
Yeah.
Do you think that it was just people being lazy and trusting that the person who did the research and the last person on the project, just trusting and just kind of stamping paper and just being done with it? Or do you think that there might be, in production, a reason to just keep going with the narrative because otherwise there's no documentary?
I am not Indigenous. And from my understanding, the 2 writers of her biographies were. So I don't know what kind of emotional whatever was at play can't speak on that, right? Because I don't know if I was making a documentary about like an iconic sex worker rights advocate, right? And then in the course of research found out that she like hadn't done sex work. I don't know.
It's gotten to the point in the podcast where I hesitate to put things in terms of sex work and like couching it in that situation that I can relate to, because I don't want to sex workize everything I come across.
Yeah.
But that is the world that I know.
Well, yeah, like
And-
because I kept thinking about like what would be a similar thing, and I would be like,
And it's really, I mean,
that was
it's
what
a
I thought
direct-
of, you know, like because it's the same thing: stolen valor, stolen trauma. Like if their backstory included like being trafficked or this or that, it would be like.
And similarly, we're a population that is somewhat averse to documentation.
Yes.
Because usually attempts to document us is just trying to arrest us or
right,
etc. If there was a similar story like you just posited about a sex worker who it turns out there's no documentation they ever did sex work, I would say she's a good hoe. She cleaned up.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I think there's probably a lot of confirmation bias.
There's enough
Right.
gray area there
Yeah.
in terms of, you know, it was the 40s, it was indigenous populations, there was a lot of really fucked up policies, all of these things. I think it's pretty easy to hand wave all of that stuff away as,
But also,
you know,
like, why
it's
would
probably
someone
fine.
lie?
Yeah,
like if I was doing my due diligence on a documentary, I don't know that I would like want to check birth records. I
True.
would just like assume that someone's telling me the truth. Like we don't, because most of us don't fabricate like key elements of our lives. Like everybody lies and tells white lies and exaggerates their achievements or every
lies indeed.
Like, well, everybody's capable of that kind of like, you know, fudging the numbers a little bit to make things seem whatever. Like, and as a good documentarian or a good journalist, it's your job to kind of like sort through that and kind of see what's really going on there. Hence
You
the
kind of have to
fact
pick
checking.
your battles.
Yeah, but like I
Yeah.
don't think that anyone goes into it like thinking they need to fact check like the most basic of information. You know what I mean?
And to be fair, this is totally, we're just Monday morning quarterbacking at this
Yeah.
point. But I don't understand football. Was that the right term?
I think so.
Whatever. At the time, to question the indigeneity of this person who's an icon in the space would probably be a pretty audacious thing to do. And maybe there were people who found things and just didn't feel like it was appropriate for them to say anything, because any number of things. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree. The birth certificate lists both of Buffy's parents and Buffy as white and lists her birthplace as the local hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts, which would be explained by the legal switcheroo process I described above. However, this birth certificate is also sequenced. She was the 49th child born that year on February 20th, 1941. And here is a clip.
Were commonly issued new birth certificates with the name of their adoptive parents. Sagarino says that is not what happened in this case.
If they had adopted her, this record right here wouldn't exist.
Sagarino explained that as each certificate is registered, they're given a number and filed in chronological order. That means Buffy could not be baby number 49, like this birth certificate says, if she had been born in Canada.
So this is 48. So this is the one right before Beverly. If you were to look at all of the other ones in the book, you would see the same thing. Everything about it is original.
As a quick aside, I just love that woman who is, I don't know who she is, but if she's not the local librarian in Stoneham who runs the local history collection, then she definitely worked with that librarian, because I was the librarian who ran the local history collection in Whitman, Massachusetts.
Okay.
And holy shit, I didn't know about ancestry until I was put in charge of that. I'm just glad that librarian in Stoneham finally got their day.
got a moment in the
You know?
sun and goes,
Yeah.
And like later in the documentary, she's like, no, it's accurate because it's in my files. Like, and I'm just like, that's the town clerk.
Oh, it's the town clerk. Oh,
yeah, that's
okay,
the one whose name is on the certificate. But I love that, like within the documentary, that she's like, it's in my records, it's in my stuff, like with 100% certainty, because it's in my custody. And I just loved that.
I love
like that,
her ownership.
Yeah, that moment of pride of like, listen, like I keep
I don't
records.
know a lot about this world, but I know my collection's fucking spotless.
Exactly.
Call in any curator, any archivist. I'll go fucking head to head.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that for this woman.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the keepers of information.
Yeah.
For making situations like this accessible and lending people the opportunity to access that information and knowledge. Support your local libraries, please.
Yes.
In past interviews, when questioned about her birth parents, she said that where adoption papers were stored in Canada had been destroyed in a fire. The CBC looked into this claim, and it seems that no such fire took place. However, the Fifth Estate didn't say how she came to know that the records were destroyed. And many survivors of the 60s scoop have been lied to in this way.
So I'm about to read it to you, but I felt worth repeating. So I wanted to take this episode to really advocate for Buffy, like every step of the way, in ways that others that watched the documentary felt that it had failed. And so I wanted to do that credulity check. So from an article on the CBC website published in 2016, when Lori Ann O'Cheek went to search for her birth records, she was told her files burned in a fire. When Carla Williams asked a different agency for her birth records, she too was told they burned in a fire. Likewise, Trevor Bass. Likewise, Jessica Syre. Wayne Snellgrove, on the other hand, was not told his birth records were destroyed. He was told there were none to begin with. Quote, I got a very nice letter from Vital Statistics telling me I don't exist, Snellgrove said. I am nowhere to be found, unquote. Different survivors dealing with different agencies from across Canada facing similar barriers to access their past. It is yet another twist in the evolving legacy of the 60s scoop. Survivors, pulled from their Indigenous homes and adopted by white families around the world, now search for their birth and treaty records only to be told they cannot be found. Quote, there was no record of my adoption, no record of the adoption agency, Lori Ann O'Cheek said. I just kept getting answers that the agency burned down and that's it, unquote.
Continuing from that same article, Carla Williams was told the same thing. She didn't believe it. A fire that I don't believe ever happened, that the Child Welfare Agency couldn't confirm at all, she said. Survivors and critics say it's another example of forced assimilation and the federal government's effort to erase their Indigenous identities. If we grow up not knowing we're Indigenous and we're entitled to the land and treaties and status, then they don't have to honor those treaties, said Colleen Cardinal, a 60s scoop survivor, author, and advocate. They don't have to resource or revenue share. That's why so many survivors can't find their way home, she said. The government has long been invested in eliminating Native Americans. Contrary to commonly held belief, the Dawes Act was meant to reduce Native folks' numbers, not account for them accurately. They did this by instituting blood quantum to determine individuals' membership to a nation. The nation didn't have say over who their own members were, and the government was invested in determining someone not Indian enough to have status. Many Native commenters on the story brought up the fact that birth certificates and settler record keeping in general is unreliable when the government was actively trying to destroy evidence of their own wrongdoing.
So, let's put the birth certificate to the side because honestly, we don't need it. In 2022, Métis lawyer Jean Théier was asked to compile a report on Indigenous identity fraud in academic institutions. And during this report, discovered a series of red flags that indicate potential identity fraud specific to indigeneity. I'm going to list some of them so you can keep them in mind as we go through Buffy's life story as she has told it. I'm omitting other red flags because they are specific to Métis heritage and academia and aren't relevant here. From Théié's report, some observations to start.
Several people interviewed for this report stated that they had been told that if they just ticked off the Indigenous identity box, the placement, scholarship, or job would be theirs. Some fraudsters begin to construct their new Indigenous identities as students in university. They take an Indigenous studies course, get intrigued, and over time begin to identify with the subject of their studies. Others do a genealogy, discover an ever so great Indigenous ancestor, and decide this entitles them to identify as Indigenous. Some start after a DNA test reveals a small percentage of Native American ancestry. Some see that there is an advantage to be gained if they identify as Indigenous, and this encourages them to do that genealogy or DNA test or resurrect an old family story.
Over time, the new identity is honed and the performance of that identity is practiced. Meanwhile, the fraudsters are provided with opportunity and funding because the Academy believes that it is furthering the new social goal of indigenizing.
Throughout Buffy's childhood and through high school, there was never any mention of her being Indigenous, which may well have been par for the course at the time, being Native American had been so stigmatized by media and settler culture. Not many people were announcing their indigeneity. However, in the 60s, as the counterculture movement started to gain traction in the mainstream, an interest in all things anti-establishment grew, and the issues surrounding civil rights for Black folks and Native folks came to the fore. It was at this time that Buffy began calling herself Native, and the song "Now That the Buffalo Are Gone" was added to her repertoire. Here's Buffy talking about being Indigenous in the music industry.
I'm Buffy Sainte Marie, and I'm a songwriter. Yeah, I always wanted to cover the base that nobody else was covering, which in my case was Indigenous stuff. I mean, Peter, Paul, and Mary with their big fancy manager, and, Joan Baez with a big powerful manager. They were at all the civil rights actions, and, the people who had big sharks for managers, they were at huge photo ops and, careerism, but nobody was showing up for Indigenous anything. And I really wanted to give that gift to the rest of the world.
That is hard to listen to.
Yeah, it definitely.
Just specifically, there's nobody else talking about this, so there was an open space waiting to be claimed by a Native voice.
So now for red flag 1, and this is, again, as outlined by Jean Théié. Many fraudsters shift their Indigenous identity claims over the years.
Got another one here, another clip that we're going to jump to.
You continue to tell a story that has no basis in reality. I don't get it. I don't know where the line is between just being deceitful, willfully deceitful, and knowingly deceitful and delusional.
In the course of our investigation, we also examined hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles, and we reviewed hours of interviews and film clips. What emerged was a shifting narrative, full of inconsistencies.
One of the first things that grabbed me or drew my attention was the patterns of behavior.
In her report on Indigenous identity fraud, Jean Théié says when you see shifting stories over time, that is a red flag.
Flags that mean, to my mind, not that in a definitive this person's a fake, but, ask some more questions.
As an example, she points to the story of well-known Canadian author Joseph Boyden, who for years was considered one of the country's great Indigenous writers, until his story unraveled.
If you see a pattern, for example, Joseph Boyden identified as multiple different Indigenous identities over a 10-year period, so over a decade. When you see something like that over time, that's one of the red flags.
In our analysis, we could find no mention of Buffy's claim to Indigenous ancestry during her teenage years. Her high school yearbook and newspaper articles about her say nothing of it. The first mention of her ancestry claims we located was this 1961 article, which calls the 20-year-old an American Indian girl. Over time, the descriptions of her became more specific. In March 1963, the Fort Lauderdale News called Buffy a full-blooded Algonquin Indian. Later that same year, the New York Times echoed that, calling her a young Algonquin Indian girl. A few months later, the Detroit Free Press said she was born a Mi'kmaq Indian in Maine. The next month, she told the local Wakefield newspaper she's half Mi'kmaq. By the end of the year, she was referred to as a Cree Indian folk singer in the Vancouver Sun. So, in less than a year, she was reported as Algonquin, Mi'kmaq, and Cree.
Well, those are so far apart that it's a little bit ludicrous, right? You know, Algonquins from Ontario or a little bit into Quebec, or Cree on the, well, you could be Cree in Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, or anywhere on the prairies, right? But Mi'kmaq, like that's the East Coast. It's really difficult to believe that somebody could miss.
So in Buffy's defense, which is what I am endeavoring to do here, so that this is a complete investigation, there are a number of reasons that this could be. Reporters could have just got it wrong. It happens all the time. Or it could be she only knew she was Native and was guessing and then found information that led her to the Cree Reserve. It does seem a very specific and small reserve to claim to come from. However, as Buffy has never explained this part of the CBC story, it's impossible to say. There's also Buffy's claim that she was adopted by a couple of Mi'kmaq ancestry/descent. However, research has shown that her father was born to immigrants from Italy, and her mother had mostly English ancestry. There is no Mi'kmaq anywhere. Again, this could be explained away by family lore. Perhaps her Sainte Marie mother was told that she had Native ancestry and guessed that it was Mi'kmaq.
Yeah. I mean, I was told that I had Native ancestry of question mark. And then I was told that 23andMe doesn't know what they're talking about. Which, to be fair, DNA tests are something we address thoroughly here. But in my case, it was just, no, we're not. No, we're not. You were lied to. Stop lying to me. Red flag number 2. Conflicting facts and stories. The fraudsters weave a web of stories that tend to become more elaborate over time. They also contain many contradictions. If we look to Buffy's story of adoption, it turns out there are a lot of contradictions. The talk page at Buffy Sainte Marie's Wikipedia page lists the number of stories she told about her birth mother. Before we get into what we're about to, can you explain what the talk page on Wikipedia is?
Oh, okay. So for every Wikipedia page, since Wikipedia is crowdsourced, it has contributors. Pages have contributors. And as a page is being built out, as it's being corrected, etc., there is a talk page. Now, if you go onto any Wikipedia profile, there's a tab at the top that says like talk page, right? And that will show you the entire discussion that's gone on between editors of the page around which things are included or not included. So someone might say, oh, this line in here doesn't have any source material to back it up, so we should take it out. Or someone else will say, I found 3 different conflicting sources for this sentence in the page. So it can be a resource when you are doing study on someone to go to not just read the Wikipedia page, but to click on the talk page and see where there are areas of confusion, of conflict, and sometimes
see where the documentarians themselves struggle.
Yeah. And
really.
So you can see kind of how much, and some talk pages are hilarious. Because you'll have people like debating Pokemon or something like that. You know what I mean?
In 1964, in the Valley Times, mentioned that she was raised as an adopted member of the Mi'kmaq tribe. 1965, she remembers living on frozen potatoes one winter on that reserve, which is near Regina, Canada.
July 1967, the Honolulu Star Bulletin. Buffy, a native of Harrison, Maine, grew up on an Indian reservation. 1968. Born on an Indian reserve near Fort Capel, but was adopted by Albert Sainte Marie a part Indian. Her foster parents moved to Maine, USA when she was still a baby. 1972, Hartford Current. Home for her is Hawaii, where she lives with her husband and about 20 adopted pets, horses, dogs, chickens, and where she was raised by her adoptive parents.
1978, in the Leader Post. Instead of abandoning her Indian roots, she returned to spend summers on the Piapot Reserve and was formally adopted into the band when she was a teenager. Quote, I grew up with both cultures. 1992. Orphaned when a few months old, she was raised by a part Mi'kmaq family in Massachusetts and later adopted by a Cree family related to her biological parents. 1999. She was posed the question, when did you go home to Canada? And replied, I visited when I was a child, and in my teens, I used to go back and forth. In 2014, it was said that she was born on February 20th in 1941 or 1942 on the Piapot Reserve. And in her mid-teens, Sainte Marie escaped into a new hobby, researching her Indian heritage. Although her adopted mother was half Mi'kmaq Indian, she had grown up knowing little about Indian history or about her own people. After reading every book about Indian culture she could find, she took a trip to the Piapot Reserve to learn more about the Cree firsthand. The warm welcome she received from her Cree relatives left a deep impression on the awkward adolescent, and she began to visit the reserve regularly.
2015. Sainte Marie had actually grown up in Massachusetts, having been adopted by relatives. 2018. Buffy Sainte Marie was born on a Cree Indian reservation in Western Canada. She was orphaned when she was only months old. 2019. She was born on the Piapot Reserve in Saskatchewan, Canada, but her mother died in an automobile accident when she was an infant. She was adopted by an American couple of Mi'kmaq ancestry and raised in Maine and Massachusetts. 2020. Beverly Sainte Marie, who acquired the nickname Buffy as a child, was born on February 20th, 1941, to Cree parents on the Piapot Reserve in Saskatchewan, Canada. Orphaned when she was a few months old, she was adopted by Albert C. Sainte Marie, a mechanic, and Wilfred Kendrick Sainte Marie, both part Mi'kmaq Indian. Her adoptive parents, who had lost a child of their own, brought her up in Wakefield, Massachusetts, where they made their home, and it was through them that she obtained United States citizenship.
Interesting. That 2020 is the first time that her actual birth certificate parents were factored into the lore. In 2022, Buffy was born in 1941 on the Piapot 75 Reserve in Capel Valley, Saskatchewan, Canada, to Cree parents. At the age of 2 or 3, Buffy was removed from her family as part of the 60s scoop. In 2023, Buffy was taken from her parents at age 2 or 3 as part of the 60s scoop.
So, okay, like that's a lot. I know, and I left that in on purpose because I can think of an explanation for this, which is that, you know, she learned more and more of her story over time, and as she learned more, she said more. However, as per the CBC investigation, her younger Sainte Marie sister, Lainey, said that she never heard anything about Buffy being Native or adopted until Buffy was in college and starting her career as a singer. They didn't elaborate beyond that. So if you're like me, you have some questions. First, if there was no paperwork for her adoption, how did her parents get her across the Canadian border? Like, you can't just take babies across. I don't know if y'all have ever had to apply for a passport, but even babies, even infants must have a passport, even babies.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt you on that one. Somebody I know quite well has a sister who was adopted. And that adopted sister came into the family from China.
Okay.
And what happened was their mother took one of her very regular trips back to China, where she is from, to visit her sisters and family, etc. And she bought 2 plane tickets. And this was must have been 1987.
Okay.
She bought 2 tickets and sat next to an empty seat on her flight there. And on her flight home, she sat with her infant, quote unquote, daughter that she had certainly not given birth to, unless immaculate conception and birth happened super fast. So this was 1987. And I know this to be true because
Okay.
I know this person personally. And
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
So
I mean, there you go. I had a question.
Things get fucky.
I had a question. You had an answer. Okay.
Okay.
So next question. How did they get her a U.S. birth certificate? The birth certificate we saw, as the town clerk said, was certified as a live birth by the doctor. So, like, I guess it's possible that the doctor colluded with them. I don't know how adoption worked in the early 40s. Maybe there was some kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink around that kind of thing, but they got her a birth certificate. So then my next question is, what were they doing in a remote part of Canada to stumble upon the young Cree mother? Like, why are they there? Why would an American couple from Massachusetts, just with no ties to Saskatchewan, not only be in Saskatchewan, but be on the Piapot Reserve?
And also happen to have a place in their hearts and home for an abandoned infant.
Well, there is this, which is
Okay.
shortly before Buffy was born. So the family that she was quote unquote adopted into had a brother, Alan, and then there was another brother who had very unfortunately passed away. And then shortly after his passing, Buffy was born. And then like 7 or 8 years later, her little sister Lainey was born. So there had been a missing, like a child loss in the family.
That's fair.
That's fair.
That's fair.
Still, like, what were they doing in Saskatchewan, right? Like,
And I mean, and also to follow up on what I had just asserted previously, I mean, if you're a couple who wants a baby and you're told that if you go here, you might be able to get a baby easy instead of having to go through the system. I don't know what the system was.
Right.
But we can invent plenty of plausible reasons why maybe that was true.
Sure. And that's what we're trying to do here. It's like, okay, let's air out all of the stuff because of the response to this expose. I was intrigued and was like, well, what happens if we give airtime to every possible explanation?
If we lend credibility and take everything that she has said and purported at face value, do we reach a conclusion that supports what she has said?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So the next question is, why weren't the other children told that Buffy was adopted? That seems weird. But maybe they adopted a child and didn't tell family and didn't tell the at that time she only had one sibling who would have been like, 6 or 7. Maybe they really didn't want anyone to know she was adopted and wanted them to feel that she was theirs. And so they didn't tell family and they didn't tell her siblings. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I know that social mores around adoption were like very different back then. And even when I was a kid, it was like this, if the implication of like, well, you're adopted was still considered some kind of like insult. So I don't know. Maybe they were like, we want everyone to think this is our natural child,
Right. And maybe they didn't want to have the conversation with a 6-year-old, but still that 6-year-old would probably notice that there was no conversation about your baby sibling is coming.
Right.
Just suddenly a 6-year-old is going to remember. 6-year-olds, kids know.
Yeah.
We don't give them enough credit. They observe things. And a 6-year-old is going to notice that there's suddenly a child around that wasn't there or led up to at all.
And I would think neighbors. I mean, this is not, they're in a small suburb outside of Boston, Wakefield or Stoneham.
God.
So like the idea that like suddenly there would be a baby where there had not been a baby before, it seems like neighbors would remember.
Any amount of credibility, as soon as you mentioned neighbors in a suburb of Boston, I mean, they would talk. They have nothing better to
exactly.
Today,
it's a bunch of curtain twitchers, like the old lady that just sits at the curtain and like opens that shit. It's a curtain twitcher.
There was a name for that one of my fans used. It was the name for the nosy neighbor in like one of those 50s shows. But yeah, there's always that. There's always somebody whose entire life is other people's drama.
Yeah.
And no suburb is without one.
Yeah.
For long.
So, okay. So those are some questions we have. According to the family members interviewed for the CBC interview, it was a known thing that Buffy had a shtick and no one was supposed to talk about it. I will mention these family members are also people that have been estranged from Buffy since she was like in her early 20s. And there were a lot of people that felt that that was not made clear enough in the expose that these family members, which was a cousin that met her once when he was a child and a niece that she's been estranged from for many, 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 many years. So it should be said that the people saying this about her are people that she has not spoken with or been involved with since she was like in her early 20s.
All right.
So, just keep that, fair, trying to be fair here.
Yes.
Okay. But beyond that, as Jean Taye puts it, Buffy said things that can't quote unquote live together, such as not knowing who her biological parents were, but also visiting family as a teenager. Both things can't be true.
Biography claims Buffy's Cree mother died unexpectedly after giving birth. In an Ottawa Citizen article from the 1960s, Buffy indicated her mom gave her up for adoption. She told a reporter, "My real mother wasn't in a position to keep me, but I always knew who she was." And just recently, in a letter to the Fifth Estate, Buffy's lawyer said the singer was a likely survivor of the 60s scoop. It's worth noting that the 60s scoop is widely recognized as having started in 1951. Buffy was born in 1941. Here's what Buffy told NPR in a 2018 interview.
You were adopted. Tell us what happened.
In Canada, we had something that's sometimes a little bit later referred to as the big scoop, where Native children were removed from the home. They're assigned a birthday. They're assigned kind of a biography. So in many cases, adoptive people don't really know what the true story is.
These stories, just multiple stories that can't all live together. They can't coexist. Like, I knew my parents. I never knew my parents, right? That's two things you can't live together.
Thoughts?
I mean, is it Dr. TA?
I don't know if she has a doctorate, a Juris Doctorate or not, but she is a lawyer.
I'm gonna bestow her an honorary PhD from ill repute.
I'm not sure if she I feel like she's a professor at this point, but she's a badass. She's
as she puts it very succinctly, those facts can't live together. They're contradicting. One simply cannot be true if the other is true. It's like basic in math, science, rationality.
The math isn't mathing.
Yeah. There's only so many lies you can tell and keep track of at the same time.
Yeah.
And then you have to invent why your lies aren't holding up together and figure out who you can assign the blame to.
I'm going to tell you the hardest part. The hardest part is like, as a reformed hustler, as a reformed scammer,
as a what?
Okay, as a hustler and a scammer.
Thank you.
As a hustler and a scammer, the hardest part is like, I want to point out the ways that she's fucked up here, but I don't want to teach other people how to do this scam.
Yes. Oh my God. I totally relate. Yes. We can't spell the T. We can't tell you why she did it wrong, but she did it wrong.
It's like, I don't want to give people like ideas or teach them how to properly scam and hustle.
That's something that you learn on the streets, and we don't give you that for free.
Yeah.
At ill repute.
Yeah.
That's not a service that we offer to you. If you want to learn.
But like, it has been, it was very frustrating because I was like, if you're going to do it, this is how you should have done it.
You did it so stupid wrong.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to do it, then do it. Like, don't f it all the way up. Like, you're so messy.
Yeah.
Don't be f***ing messy.
Yes.
I don't care what scam you're pulling, what ass you need to cover. Don't be messy. Certainly her little sister would remember Buffy as a child going to visit her native birth family in Piapot during her early teen years. If she had gone on these visits, it would have been before she met the Piapot family, and she would have still been living at home. So her little sister would remember and know the trips where Buffy was visiting her biological family, if she had been doing so.
Right? Like, that was the first thing I was like, your sister says that she didn't hear anything about this till Buffy was away at college and had started her career. And yet Buffy has said, oh, I knew who my parents were. I would go back and visit as a teenager. I remember living on frozen potatoes. So, okay, so if you remember living on frozen potatoes on the reserve, that means you weren't adopted away until you were like, what, 7, 8 years old?
Yeah.
Like, saying like as a teenager, like I was welcomed back. Like, and yet Lainey's going, I have no,
marry.
And it's like Lainey would have been in the home. She would have remembered that her sister would go take these trips to Canada,
Right.
and would know why she was taking these trips, i.e. that she was adopted, like, and she was going to visit her biological parents, like our biological family or biological relatives. Like, it just...
As a little sister, I can tell you if at any point there was any sense that bitch was getting something that I wasn't, there would be hell to pay.
Yeah.
As the little sister, I mean, I'm projecting clearly, but no, siblings will remember their siblings. They were children at the same time. It's not the same as implying that adults simply didn't have the facts together or she was too young to know.
Yeah.
Lainey was too young to know too, and Lainey doesn't remember all about this.
Yeah.
As I understand.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like,
right.
Now a caveat before this next part, I remember Jacqueline Keeler saying this, but I couldn't find the interview where she said it, but because in doing my research, I consumed so much media.
Yeah.
And the relevancy of the comment didn't strike me until later. And then I had a whole shit fest trying to go like track it back down. But I'm not trying to malign Jacqueline Keeler. Like, she did say this unless it was in a fever dream. And if it was, Jacqueline, I'm very sorry and just come correct with me. But I feel like this was said, and I'm very sure I did not pull this out of my ass. So
lay it on.
So,
or do you want me to put it out?
Further, as Jacqueline Keeler pointed out in another interview, Piapot Reserve is small. When Buffy was born, there were only about, I think she said, like 400 people living on the reserve. So surely it would have been easy to narrow down the women of birthing age, those women that passed away the year that Buffy was born or that had a child the year Buffy was born. Like, it's hardly an insurmountable task for, say, a private investigator or a forensic genealogist.
For reference, that's about the size of my high school class.
Right? Like when I saw it put in that way, I was like, okay, yeah, I get why you felt the math wasn't mathing.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're going
absolutely.
like, how is it that someone that is a millionaire, so has like the full right on a very small reserve. So if there's 400 people and then you cut that in half, because men and women tend to be in equal measure. So now you're looking at 200, and now you've got to look at women of birthing age, right? So then you're going to cut that in half again. You're going to narrow it down to about 100 people, right? And then once you've got a number like 100, it's not small, but it's manageable. And
especially when you consider births happen at a pretty spaced out rate. You don't have 100 women of birthing age just pop them out 3 times a day. Like, you can really keep track of things at that point. And given the community, you know who was pregnant.
Exactly.
Because they were seeking care.
Exactly.
Because the community provides that care.
Exactly. And so, which makes it more interesting that when she had Delia Opokoku in the 70s go to the Piapot Reserve and try to gather testimony, people remembered, oh yeah, there was this woman and she gave birth and then she gave the child away to like an American couple in the area. So none of those people remembered that woman's name. Like, I'm not Indigenous, but in studying this phenomenon and everything else, one thing, Native people know who their people are.
Yeah.
They know. So the fact that like, yeah, no, that totally happened, I just can't remember her name.
That's a very white thing to factor into a story.
Well, it just to me, it diminishes the credibility of those oral histories. And I know I'm a white person saying that about an Indigenous person giving an oral history, but it just kind of is counter to like everything that I've heard, which is like if you could isolate it to a reserve and you could isolate it to a date and a year, and you went back, that people would remember her, but no one would remember her name or who her people were, or who her descendants were, or who her relations were. Like in Native circles, they have this saying, like all my relations. And it's because they're like knowledge keepers whose like whole job is just to remember like who married who and had kids with who, so that when people start dating, they don't date people that they're related to. Like, because these communities are very small. So like it doesn't make sense. I'm not going to say anyone's a liar, but it seems to fly in the face of convention. However, I'm not Indigenous. I did not survive the 60s scoop. It's not my place, but
there's plenty we don't know.
Yeah, there's plenty we don't know. So like allowances for that, but it does seem a little like you're telling me that you put all of these resources behind trying to find your birth parents from this place that had a relatively small population, and like it would be better if no one remembered her, but it's like if people remembered this woman but then couldn't remember like her name, that to me is weirder than not remembering her. Like if that makes sense. Like, like someone's grandma would be like, oh yeah, that was so-and-so. Like
literally literally somebody would.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. But you know what? But maybe because of incarceration, because of the 60s scoop, because of the Indian Act, because of colonial, institution-wide, goals of
the imposed bureaucracy
of erasure, it may have been that there aren't a lot of old people on the reserve because their life expectancy was shorter because of these other things. So maybe when she went there were people that remembered a story about something like that, but they weren't elders, and like they couldn't.
Sure.
Maybe.
Sure.
So like I'm trying to leave it wide open.
Yes.
Right. Trying to leave that field wide open.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And further, with the ease of genetic testing over that last 10 years, it would be a simple matter to take a DNA test and to encourage those on the Piapot Reserve to also take one to see if a match can be made. While Native folks are quite reasonably hesitant to give their DNA away, in a case where it would be about paternity rather than filling out a database, and for an icon like Buffy, surely there would be at least a couple volunteers.
You would think, right? Like, because if a big part of healing from the 60s scoop is also, trying to bring family members home. And here's the thing is Native folks do use DNA testing, not to determine membership, but because you can't, DNA testing is not tribe specific. There's a lot of issues around the DNA for Native American whatever. But say you have someone that says, I was adopted out of this reserve. This was like who the parents were. Like it can be used in like paternity testing to determine if someone is the actual child. And so I would think in an instance like this with Buffy, right? That her own adoptive family would be like, yeah, let's get this squared away. Like, let's get this enshrined so you can get your citizenship, so you can get your status. Like, you would think.
Let us claim you. Let's make it official. Let's see if any of your ancestors are still here. Maybe you've got distant cousins. Maybe you've got, someone. You would have some relations left on the reserve, you would think. Literally someone. And in the face of what had to feel like the establishment trying to steal credibility away from a respected member of the community, I can absolutely see why anybody would rally behind that person and take their side, just because this is the person that we know and they are being challenged by the authority that we all have found to be aggressively, violently trying to harm and silence and remove us. So like, I get why you'd want to rally behind that person.
Yeah.
And you would think that in that case, and that's why, and that's just to speak to why people have been very incredulous about what's come through about Buffy in recent years. But that same fervor, one would think, would be present amongst people who could absolutely prove her story and be part of her success. Everybody wants to be part of the win, especially when it's someone they love, especially when it's family. You want to carry your family over that finish line.
And I want to say, like, we did quote from Pia Potts, I think, great-granddaughter, who referred to Buffy as her auntie. Ahead of this expose, that family released a statement to the press saying that they unequivocally claim her, that she is a member of their family, and that every member of their family is Cree and from Pia Pot. Unequivocal support for her and her connection to the family. So that should be stated. The family has come out very strongly saying, like, she's been adopted by Cree custom, and that means more than any colonial paperwork. It means more than anything else. And this was an adoption that took place over years and was the product of years of doing ceremony together, engaging in trust, protection, etc., like support. So let it be said. And here's the thing. No one, I have not seen anyone questioning the validity of that custom adoption. Nowhere. Like, no one is questioning the validity of that adoption. She is 100% unequivocally part of that family.
Yes, and that's not being called into question.
No.
That is established. That is strictly, in my understanding, up to that family and their traditions and their culture to decide.
Yeah.
That's not what we're discussing.
Yeah.
That's not the point at hand. That can be true. And yet, other damning things can also be true. Yes. And that, I think, is really a crux of our whole podcast is women can do both.
Moving on. So red flag number 3 is family stories and family secrets. And this is from Jean Thé's report. Embellishers use family stories to justify their Indigenous identity claim. They relate family stories about a long ago ancestor who was Native, or an ever so great Indian or Native granny. Stories are not proof of Indigenous identity. Even if these stories have some small basis in fact, they cannot be taken as evidence of Indigenous identity. In fact, they are evidence of no living connection to an Indigenous people or a community.
That's really important.
Yeah.
Let's take a second to pause on that. The fact that there was somebody in your ancestry who was Indigenous or Native isn't the same thing, and isn't what protections and bills and everything are made. Like, it's not about somebody who has never had a connection to that culture claiming rights or benefits because a few molecules in their DNA connect them distantly to a culture that they've never participated in.
Like, I have a 5 times. So that's back like 7 generations. I have a 5 times great grandfather that married a Cherokee woman. They got married in like 1805. Okay. That does not make me Indigenous. Like, I couldn't like that's so far, like that's like over 200 years ago. And once she married, like, the children lived as white, and every generation afterwards lived as white. They did not maintain a connection to their Cherokee community. Because I looked, I was like, are there cousins? Are there distant cousins? Did some of the children go to Indian Territory? Did any of the grandchildren get on the rolls? Nope.
Right.
Nope. They all, it was like, that happened and we're not talking about it. And so, and that's, I think, what they mean by a living connection It's like, so even if I was like, I'm going to reconnect with my Cherokee roots, right? I would still need something to connect to. And if I don't have any living ancestors, even if they were like distant ass cousins, but let's say one of the children went to Indian Territory and lived there, like removed there, and had family and relations and continued and was alive today, I would even argue like maybe if I could contact those people and begin to reconnect despite the distance of that relation. But like most people, when we're talking about an ancestor that's that far back, that there's no living descendants to like, there's nothing to reconnect to.
This is something that's very common in American people, especially American white people, because simply being American is pretty generic. America is pretty fucking new. And we want to have a connection to something deeper and older than ourselves.
Right.
Because we feel like, well, I'm just American and white. So what else it's like everything's already catered to us and somehow we need more.
Yeah.
And so I like that's where you see people who are like, oh, I'm Irish. No, you're not. You were born in Palo Alto.
Right.
Your mom was born in San Jose.
I would say even, okay, so my mom is French. So her father was from France and her mother was American, and they met during World War II. And she, unfortunately, my grandmother passed away when my mom was a very young child. So she did not know her. So she was primarily raised by her mom's family and her French father, right? So she got some of that cultural transmission because he was from France, right? And when my mom told me we were French, I never had to question it because my grandfather came to visit and he spoke French and had an accent and cooked differently, and like I didn't need to ask any questions around that. Like it was unequivocal. Like
it wasn't those are these and these are those, but they all look the same.
Yeah, it was like, yes, absolutely, I'm French. Like that.
Yeah.
But even there, all I can say is like in terms of like culture, what got passed down to me is that, you know, when I was in like middle school and high school, my mom would put like baguette and brie in my lunchbox, right? Like, I mean, but that, like, I think we did the Yule log like once. Like, there's a chocolate log thing, and there's like charms in it. Like, okay, but like, maybe once, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was my mom trying to stay connected to her father and her father's culture. Right. But when I went to go visit, like as a graduation gift, we went to his village in France. Like I didn't need to question that because I had living connections to the culture. Right. I didn't need to find out through an ancestry test. I didn't need to find out by doing my family tree. Like it was something.
If it comes to you as a surprise.
And I mean, accepting 60 scoop kids that didn't find out they were adopted or native until they were adults, but we're not talking about those people. Like, and so I read the book by Deloria called Playing Indian. It's really great, and his explanation for this is about America's nationhood and what she had brought up, which is it's very young as a country, which is so like in France when they rebelled against the king and had a revolution, it was very different from the American Revolution because they were in France. They like killed the king and stuff and instituted new laws and hierarchies and government, right? But they remained French. They were never disconnected from their Frenchness, right? And they actually dove into their Frenchness to build up the passion to revolt. Like, right?
Because the monarchy was not representing what it means to be truly a patriot of that country.
Yes. Now, so now during the American Revolution, we didn't kill any kings. We didn't do any of that. We were a colonial outpost, and we said, we are now a separate nation. We don't want to belong to you anymore. So American identity was specifically divorcing itself from an English identity, right?
Right.
So now we're sitting here Well, I'm an American. Well, what does that mean? Well, what was here when we got here? Natives.
Uh-huh.
So then Americans start to actually identify with the very natives that they are genociding as a part of their American heritage.
Yes.
And so that's when you started to see all of these clubs crop up where they would play Indian, Boy Scouts, everything else, because it was like, well, we're Americans now, like, so we're going to take from this culture. So that's how he kind of broke it down. I'm not doing it justice. I'm not a preeminent Native scholar. But that was what I pulled out of it as like a member of the settler class. And it made a lot of sense to me.
If being a member of a culture is something that you were denied because of some incidents of your lifetime, or if it was something that was taken away from you because your parent had something taken away from them in their lifetime, and it is foundational to them and their disconnect from that community that has been passed down to you, I feel like that is something that I am not prepared to comment on and am no place to comment on. So I'm going to shut the fuck up instead.
No, but I think this is getting at part of the
white
problem.
People, it's not, if you've never had a connection to the culture, if your parents never had a connection to the culture, if your grandparents never had a connection to the culture, if there's no direct relative in your lifetime, your parent, your grandparent, maybe great-grandparents if they were alive, and actually an influence in your life, if nobody that you know in your direct heritage remembers any connection to a native nation, then it's because you don't have a connection there. Because you have somebody in your family. Like, would you be so eager to claim the fucking gun nut who shoots people in public or tries to mow down somebody in a city?
Yeah.
Like, would you be as eager to claim that person and account for them as your relative as you would be to claim something that you feel is cool to you, or in whatever way bestows financial benefits on you, which is what it really comes down to. People fake these things or inflate these things or reimagine themselves as being a member of a community they've never belonged to, frequently because doing so gives them access to resources that they wouldn't otherwise have, and they think they're entitled to it.
It also imparts moral authority. If I identify with a Native community, then that relieves me of the burden of being part of the settler class.
Of being occupiers.
Yes.
Of being an occupying class in Native lands.
Yeah.
Yes.
So so in addition to there being like resource benefit, there's also moral benefit.
It's kind of like white people who are like, look, I wasn't guilty. Like, my family didn't own slaves because we didn't move to America until after slaves were abolished, until after the Civil War.
You still have reaped the benefits of whiteness. Like, that doesn't really hold a lot of water.
And a culture that was, and a society that was explicitly built on the backs of slaves and of marginalized people.
Yeah. So this is part B of red flag number 3 and this is from Teye's report. Another disturbing trend is for fraudsters to claim their mother or grandmother had an affair with a Native man and that this accounts for their indigeneity. It is surely suspicious when anyone is so ready to slander their mother or grandmother's reputation and integrity, especially when there is no evidentiary basis for such claims. Sometimes other family members hotly dispute such stories. In the absence of any proof, there should be no automatic acceptance of alleged family secrets.
Now, let's look at Buffy's story. When confronted with the evidence found by the CBC, she posted a video response where she lays her claims at the feet of her deceased mother. Let's take a look at this.
My growing up mom, who was proud to be part Mi'kmaq, told me many things, including that I was adopted and that I was Native. And later in life, as an adult, she also told me some things that I've never shared out of respect for her, that I hate sharing now, including that I may have been born on the wrong side of the blanket. This was her story, and it has never been my place to share it.
So, wrong side of the blanket is an old expression meaning someone who was conceived out of wedlock or as a result of adultery. It is unclear if Sainte Marie is implying that the woman who raised her, Winifred Sainte Marie, may in fact be her biological mother. This is a departure from the well-known story that Sainte Marie was born in Piapot First Nation before being adopted by an American family in 1941. APTN News has asked for clarification, and a publicist working for Sainte Marie responded, "Buffy says her mother told her many things, and she does not know for certain which is the case."
I also found a new family, a chosen family. And they took me in as an adult, in accordance with Cree law and traditions, and they claimed me as their own.
Now, some of the questions regarding Sainte Marie's identity stem from a Massachusetts birth certificate for a Beverly Jean Santa Maria, a certified copy of which APTN News has obtained. The birth certificate has the same birth date of Buffy Sainte Marie, the same given names for Buffy, which are Beverly Jean, as well as the same given names for the parents who raised her. There are also obvious similarities between the family names Santa Maria and Sainte Marie. In a 2012 biography, Buffy's sisters quoted as saying that the Santa Marias became Sainte Marie because of anti-Italian prejudice after World War II. A publicist working for Sainte Marie would not confirm nor deny that the birth certificate belongs to her. Meanwhile, Sainte Marie's Cree family, who adopted her in 1964, unequivocally support her. A statement from members of the Piapot family says, "The accusations which are about to be made of our Auntie Buffy are hurtful, ignorant, colonial, and racist. And we claim her as a member of our family, and all of our family members are from the Piapot First Nation. To us, that holds far more weight than any paper documentation or colonial record keeping ever could." There's a lot more to this story. For all the details, make sure to read the article on aptnnews.ca.
I like that in that video at one point, the captioning
says Satan.
The auto captioning called her Satan. Yeah. And then the second part about this video that really tickled me was, this guy reminds me so much of our producer Josh.
Yeah.
Like just a tiny little bit.
Yeah.
And because I don't see him every day and I'm not related to him.
Yeah.
He's got some Joshy vibes.
Yeah.
So from the Lakota Times, as far back as 1964, in an editorial to the Wakefield Daily Item, Sainte Marie's paternal uncle, Arthur Santa Maria, stated that Buffy Sainte Marie, quote, has no Indian blood in her, not a bit of Cree. Her brother Alan also attempted to clarify his sister's identity in a 1972 letter to the Denver Post, in which he wrote, "To associate her with the Indian and to accept her as his spokesman is wrong."
I have thoughts about that.
What?
I said I've
You got some thoughts? You got some ideas?
I have hustler thoughts. I have hustler scammer thoughts about that, which is
that's why we're listening.
Yeah, which is, I mean, he's correct. He's correct.
Yes. Yeah.
But that is some settler ass middle class shit right there. Cause like,
to rat, like snitches get stitches and wind
like
up in
that?
ditches.
Like it's just also like, I don't know.
Ew.
Like I don't support what she did, but at the same time, it's just like I'm like that is a messy family. There's clearly some animosity there, right? So in 1975, according to Buffy's niece, the daughter of Buffy's older brother, Alan, Buffy and a producer for Sesame Street were on a plane, and it turned out that Alan was the pilot. So during this chance encounter, Buffy introduced Alan to the producer as her brother. Later, Alan got a call from the Sesame Street producer asking if he was Indigenous and whether or not Buffy was his biological sister. Apparently, Alan said that Buffy was his biological sister and that they were both Caucasian. Shortly after this, Alan received a letter from Buffy's attorney which read, quote, "We have been advised that you have without provocation disparaged and perhaps defamed Buffy and maliciously interfered with her employment opportunities," unquote. A handwritten letter from Buffy accompanied the letter in which she threatened to accuse her brother publicly of sexually abusing her as a child if he brought up her ancestry again. She made her...
Holy shit.
Now, I have thoughts. I think that Buffy's credibility is pretty shot at this point. And some have said this demonstrates the lengths that she was willing to go through to protect a lie. However, two things can be true at the same time as well.
Yeah, 100%.
You know, and so this one I want to like hold space for victims because part of the narrative is his niece says like, no, like they were on good terms. Everything was friendly until like this encounter, and then she got this letter.
That means fuck
and
all.
I'm like,
that means
I'm
nothing.
Like, oh, you except for 3 years previous, when he was on a letter writing campaign telling everyone that she wasn't actually Indigenous. Like that, like those two things can't live together, baby. Like your dad couldn't have been on great terms with Buffy while simultaneously running like a letter writing campaign, which he had sent to multiple publications saying that she was not Indigenous. That guy was actively trying to undermine her for years, but they were on good terms until that chance encounter. I'm sorry, but
that's simply not true.
Two things can't live together like that. Like that makes me think that her brother was a snake. If he's like, oh, hi, Buffy, I love you. Yes, I'd love to come visit you in Hawaii. Yeah, I'll bring my kids. While meanwhile, unbeknownst to her, he's on a letter writing campaign. Like, I'm sorry.
That context is actually really good.
Like,
I didn't realize that they were actively making plans and hanging out together.
And like, I'm sorry, but that tells me that he was like duplicitous.
Furthermore,
you know,
adults
so that doesn't
grow
bode,
past.
Yeah, it doesn't bode well for his character. It's like that's
no, it doesn't at all.
So you're gonna go have fun in Hawaii on your sister's dime while actively trying to undermine her career. And this is like we're taking out of like whether or not she's actually Indigenous, but just like on its face as like a family dynamic. If we're just talking about a family dynamic, he was leading her to believe they were tight while simultaneously trying to undermine everything that she had. He was doing both things. And like, so that, and she characterized him, like after he passed, she characterized him as a bully, as a sadist, and as someone that sexually abused her. And she claimed that other members of her father's family also sexually abused her. And a lot of times victims do wait until the perpetrator has passed away before they speak publicly. And a lot of times if the perpetrator is a member of the family, they do remain in relationship with them.
Yes, because they're your fucking family and you can't cut out one person in your family and still have the rest of your family around them. It's like blurring out the word "and" in sentences.
Yeah.
It is absolutely not disqualifying to a victim's narrative that they maintain a constructive or positive or extant relationship with their abuser.
Yeah.
That is frequently all they can do. And also frequently part of the abuse.
And so I found that part of the documentary because I just did the math while I was watching it. And that immediately just completely undercut any credibility that her niece had because she was saying like, oh no, like they were on great terms until this moment. Meanwhile,
no, they weren't.
Meanwhile, for years previous to that chance encounter, he had been on a letter writing campaign to undermine her career. Like that, those two things can't live together, as Jean Taye said, right? It's like
that. And let's just take a second to appreciate what an excellent turn of phrase that is. Like those two things can't live together is such a great turn of phrase.
Yeah.
I want, as we have mentioned and continue to mention, we are taking Buffy's word at face value. Yeah. We are trying to approach this credulously.
Right.
And something that's important to me is to acknowledge that one part of her story is that she was sexually abused. And I don't find that something that I need to question.
Yeah.
That a young woman, adopted or not, was sexually abused does not raise any... Yeah, probably. So when she speaks about her brother, and especially and I don't know all of the nuances and details, but I imagine that when she told her brother that if you don't stop telling the truth about her, which was his right to tell the truth, I will tell the truth about you, is a different thing from I will make up stories that
And that was my
those
thinking
are two
too.
different things.
And here's where we get back to like this family dynamic is messy. I know these people are still living. I'm trying to be kind because I don't know. But I will say that someone that leaves home at 17 and never comes back, immediately starts telling stories of being adopted, finds a whole nother family to be enmeshed with, right? That tells me something, okay? Yeah. Then secondly, if someone does construct this kind of lie where they literally have made themselves like someone else, that lends more credence to the idea that whatever was going on in that home was not ideal. Because why would someone want to run away so badly?
A teenager, especially. It's important to remember that you said she was 17 when she left?
For college. Which like her mom did all this stuff to get loans so that like she could go to Amherst College. So, and she had said in multiple interviews, like, you know, that her mother's side of the family was amazing. But, you know, on the male line, there were some predators. That was how she put it, you know? And so it just makes me feel like, you know, something happened, and that doesn't excuse what she's done, but it also, in a weird way, actually lends credence to her assertions.
And furthermore, I don't care what else is going on in your story. I don't care what else is going on in your life. Allegations of sexual abuse need to live a little bit independently from the rest, because you can be a scoundrel, you can be a liar, you can be a con artist extraordinaire, and that does not discount your story of childhood, especially childhood sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Because that is something that is upsetting enough to one's life and formulation of their persona and their identity that a lot of people are liars and scoundrels because of childhood abuse.
Which is my point, which is kind of like,
we don't need to call some things into question.
I also don't want to cast aspersions on her brother, who is not here to respond to these allegations. However,
of course,
I like by acknowledging that she made the allegations is all that we're doing.
Yeah.
You know, and I think also that by her niece going on a national news broadcast and saying that those accusations were 100% untrue when she cannot possibly know because she was not there, right?
She is speaking as the child of the accused.
Well, and what I'm saying is if she's going on a national news program and saying 100% Buffy is lying about having been sexually abused, when she cannot know that is true, she cannot know because she was not there.
How old was she?
She wasn't alive when she was alive for when the letter came, but she wasn't alive for Buffy's childhood. She wasn't there. Right? So she cannot know unequivocally whether or not the allegations that Buffy was making are true. Like, she can't know that unequivocally. But if she's going to go on a national news program and say that these charges were false, then I think that we are within our rights to ask questions and offer a rebuttal. So, but here is the clip.
Just 1 month after receiving Buffy's letter, Alan wrote to his father. I received a real jolt when she accused me of being a child molester when we were children. In that letter, she convinced me that she has sunk to moral depths probably lower than we can even imagine. It is not unusual for survivors of sexual abuse to wait to tell their stories, and we can't know for sure which version of Buffy's childhood is real. But Heidi thinks she's not telling the truth about Alan.
So now my dad knows the people at PBS went back to Buffy, who went to her very rich, fancy Beverly Hills attorney. Now Dad knows he's in some hot water. If you tell people that I am Caucasian, I will tell people that you are a pedophile.
Heidi says Buffy's message appeared to have its intended effect. In that same letter to his father, Alan said he had decided to back off because he didn't have the resources to fight her in court. But he believed that the truth about his sister would come out someday.
I really love my anonymity. But then I felt I owed it to my father, and I owed it to my grandfather, and I owed it to my great-grandfather.
Does that change anything for you?
That person can also be a scoundrel and lie about a lot of things at the same time. We discount what someone says when we discover that they're a liar with reason and rationality. But in doing so, we do lose credibility in the factual things that they say.
Yeah. I mean, I get a lot from that exchange, which is, like I said, one, it makes it seem like this was an ongoing dialogue between Alan and their father. I understand going, well, she's telling a lie and it's wrong.
Yeah.
I understand that, right? But I also, just as a family member, I couldn't imagine going on like a letter writing campaign to try to like undermine a sibling. Like it's just so hard for me to wrap my mind around that. It just makes me feel like but to be like actively taking advantage of her celebrity and her money, not saying that she was supporting them, but just that like it was said somewhere where it was like, well, no, like they would like, we would come visit for vacation, da da da. So it's like, so you're okay, like accessing the resources that this lie brought her, but then at the same time, you also want to see her like undermined. Like it just kind of like, it just is like, it's hard to make sense of it. And my final analysis is like, clearly there was some kind of lifelong animosity between these two. At the end of the day, like if it was like a family member, I just feel like I would be like, well, like I'm not going to lie for them. Like they're on their own. I just can't imagine like actively like trying to make that happen, if that makes sense. It's like I would take like a hands off, like unless we're talking about like murder, like or rape.
And the
what I didn't like that was missing was like, what was the father's response? Like that, like those are the things about this expose that kind of bugged me was like I'm seeing one side of a communication. Like what was the dad's response to this? Right? Like I want to see that because that's going to give me way more context around like the family's positionality around her claim. Like it just seemed like a misstep. It just seemed like this is not the place to litigate this.
You summed it up perfectly, frankly. I believe Buffy when she says that she was sexually abused, if for no other reason than that it makes more sense that she would have spent her childhood dreaming her way into a different life and identity as a form of escape from the abuse taking place in the house. And just because she threatened to make that truth public in order to keep him quiet doesn't mean that it didn't happen. What is irrefutable is that her son Cody and her little sister Lainey took DNA tests and posted the results on Facebook. Lainey was shown to have no native ancestry, and it showed that Lainey and her nephew were genetically related, which means one of four things. Either Buffy was the biological white child of the Sainte Maries, or Buffy's mother had an affair, or Buffy's father had an affair which produced a child and the Sainte Maries took care of it, or that both Buffy and her little sister Lainey were both adopted from the same mother. And it's just the Occam's razor of it all.
Yeah, that's a lot of convoluted stuff.
There's a lot of reaching. There's a lot of crafting
and to be honest,
to support a narrative.
And to be honest, unnecessary in the age of DNA testing.
Which didn't exist when she fabricated her lies.
And which must have...
What a bummer time. What a bummer time to be a con artist.
So many things are possible. It could be that Buffy was the product of an affair, but why wouldn't her mother tell her who her father was? Why the elaborate lie of adoption? Surely someone must have known if an adoption took place. This was a small town. Surely people would remember a couple returning from a vacation with a brand new baby. Wouldn't they tell her siblings that she was adopted at some point? Why didn't her parents come forward at some point and correct the lie? I think the answer to the last one is easy. Parents love their children helplessly. And if it was explained to them that this ruse was necessary for Buffy's success, then likely they didn't feel like ruining her career.
Yeah. Yeah. Why ruin the trajectory of a child who is supporting themselves, doing well, kicking at, like, in her own way, like really thriving? Why try to cut? Why undermine that?
Yeah.
As parents, because you love your child, and also, like, what are you trying to do? Destroy their career so they have nobody except you in their life? Like that, I wouldn't trust parents who throw their kids under the bus. I am never incredulous when it comes to a parent treating their child in a way that's fucked up. Like, why would a mother tell one child one thing and the rest of the kids the other? I don't know, but I know a lot of people who've had their entire lives and psyches ruined because of mothers who have made decisions like that. Other cases have happened where the mother has done exactly that for reasons that I'm not prepared to speculate on. But that is not outside the realm of possibility.
It's always possible, but when you look at the other evidence, which is her mom was the one that facilitated her being able to go to Amherst. Her mom and her grandma bought her first guitar. Her mom was like, it seems like she got a lot of love and encouragement from her mom. So for this to be like a sudden twist in the narrative, like it doesn't kind of go along with like the other stuff. So apparently a few months before the Fifth Estate documentary came out, but like after Buffy was made aware of the investigation, she made an appearance on a friend's podcast, supposedly to promote her documentary, Carry It On. And I say this because I have been friends with someone that has been the subject of an expose. And you, in a story like this, they have to give you like a right of reply. You have to be able to say, reasonable.
You have to be able to rebut the claims made against you.
Yeah.
Journalistically, they need to be able, like, journalists have a responsibility to tell the whole story.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. And because, in some instances, a person may have, receipts that they can deploy, to refute the claims. And those might end up being included in the piece as a way to, balance the story. And that's the thing is in order to avoid a defamation case, like one of the key elements of defamation is malicious intent. That you're doing it knowing that you are trying to actively ruin this person's reputation.
Trying to disparage.
Yeah. And so if you don't let someone know ahead of time, like, hey, we're working on this piece and this is what you're being accused of and this is who's accusing you. Like if you don't allow for right of reply, it's harder to argue that it wasn't malicious.
That's excellent insight.
Yeah. And so because you need to have at least the appearance of fair and balanced coverage. And in order for it to be fair and balanced, you have to let the other person respond. So a few months before the Fifth Estate documentary came out and after Buffy was made aware of the investigation, she made an appearance on an old friend's podcast where she said this about her origin story.
And having had two wonderful biographers and two wonderful documentaries in the world, there's just, your life can start to feel like a list of bullet points. And normally when I'm going to do an interview with someone, I'll ask for questions in advance and then I'll answer them in writing and send them back because I like to clarify. I'm always trying to clarify the urban legend stories because some of them are just not true and others are confusing. I think there's been confusion regarding my pie pot adoption, for instance. I was adopted into the pie pot family, not I was adopted out of pie pot reserve. That makes a big difference. And there are a lot of ways that you can try and clarify things, but urban legend is what it is, and sometimes you just kind of got to live with it.
Urban legend is what it is.
Yeah. Rule 1 of scamming, rule 1 of hustling is a lie is a lie, a scam, a hustle is a lie that you have made true. And this to me just reeks of someone trying to make a lie they told. Like they're trying to, it just seems like, okay, so she's saying, I wasn't adopted out of pie pot. Like that's something that people like have misunderstood. Using the word misunderstanding, confused. They got confused, right? But in the 70s, she hires a Cree lawyer to find her biological parents, and that Cree lawyer went to pie pot. Why? Who told her to start there? And it's like, because that's what she said. She was the one that said that. And essentially had this Cree woman on a fucking fool's errand in the 70s.
Trying to prove a mistruth.
Chomping around pie pot reserve trying to make a lie true. Like, it just, you see all the places, I think when she, was adopted into this Cree family, she was like, okay, I've made my lie true, so I'm good, and then it's like, oh, let me cement this. Like maybe by taking advantage of the disconnection of the 60s scoop, by taking advantage of all of these understandings about colonial record keeping around residential schools and the disappearing of Indian children, I can send her out. She'll get enough evidence. We'll be able to submit it to court or whatever, and I'll be granted citizenship. I'll be made legitimate. Right. And she's never been a Canadian citizen. She's never been. She doesn't have Indian status under the Indian Act, like any of that. So this plan did not work. But it seems to me like I don't think that her attorney knew that this was a fool's errand. Like, and that to me is what's like insidious is it's like, I'm going to give you not all of the information and then send you out to like basically get these people to lie or to make my lie true. But then like no one's guilty because they're not in on it. And then like, I didn't do it. It's like, it's a third party went in and so like, it's just
a very powerful person in the zeitgeist, in the culture, in that culture in particular, but also just a culturally relevant person, a celebrity coming in, asking for anything that supports this idea.
Yeah.
And at that point, she's a cultural icon. She's an institution. Yeah. She's representative. She herself has claimed that, nobody was stepping into the role of speaking on behalf of this particular marginalized community. And she felt like that was where she should claim her fame or whatever. But you've got to, in all of this, keep in mind that these are individuals, these are small, who are being approached by someone who's, in this case, I don't think the lawyer she hired was an outsider. The lawyer she hired was an actual Cree lawyer. Yeah. And even more so at that point, like, well, I don't want to besmirch the legacy of this icon. And on top of that, I don't want to fuck up this woman's law career. Like, how hard is it to gain that stature as, as an attorney in the first place? Yeah. And like, I don't want to undermine Buffy, but I also don't want to undermine this attorney and to what end? Yeah. Like, who's even asking these questions? Like, to whom are we answering? Yeah, because if we're answering to settlers, then the answer is, F you. We already know.
Yeah.
Like, and I can see that. I can understand why that would be the case if you do not realize the lie is coming, that the call is coming
inside the
inside the
house.
house.
Yeah. So I've laid out a lot of excuses for the inconsistencies in Buffy's story, but they were all rendered moot by the public Facebook post her own son, Cody, published a few years ago. And this is a public post. This was not me going into friending someone and then like someone.
You do not have that kind of time.
I do not have that time. This was this screenshot ended up getting shared in the Indian Country Reddit subreddit, and it was also shared on like TikTok. But this post was made like 3 years ago publicly, and as far as I know, is still public. So, would you like to do the part and do the dramatic reading?
So, this is a screenshot of a Facebook. It looks like a comment on a post by Cody Wolfchild responding to a commenter saying, but she's actually half Italian and half English. Total Ellis Island immigrant lineage. Cool part is Cree, like all tribal nations, don't give a if the US and Canada won't recognize their Commonwealth/identities as they write them. Mom got accepted to the tribe as a white girl. Yes, it can happen to you too. Hehe. Nothing wrong with that, but yes, she also colored her hair dark as possible and wore dark makeup. Kind of like Rachel Dolezal, the lady who said she was black, but it was just in style. Mom ain't Indian in the legal way most of the audience probably doesn't realize this issue is actually referring to. Big-nosed Italian girls were not popular in the 50s, but say it's because you're an Indian and then suddenly it fits and goes with the rest of their story. This may sound a little scathing or like a huge lie was told, but it's not that big of a lie, and there's a good reason why she stretched the truth back then, being it was harder for women, so any little bit more helped. I always felt like my mom was blaming her unconventional looks that didn't work for most American European women back then on being Indian. She got outcast in school, and her brother wouldn't say she was related to him, them, whatever. Kind of made it for trauma, the lies. Had to lie about being Indian to stop the teasing in school. So her own son has this take, which
and this was on a public Facebook page, like, and this didn't, like, for 3 years this just sat publicly on Facebook, like it didn't seem to cause any kind of a kerfuffle.
I wonder what went on behind the scenes there.
Yeah,
his mom must have seen it. And as the squeeze on her own credibility took place.
All of his posts kind of come across like this, which
navel gazing, just reflecting on things. It doesn't seem scathing at all. Well, it doesn't seem like he's trying to drop knowledge.
No, but I mean, they just kind of like there's another one where he makes a comment about that he's had a trust fund since Sesame Street, which means he can say whatever he wants about his mom.
Whoa.
It just, between the brothers' letter writing campaign in the early 70s, her son's kind of manic posting or sort of like stream of consciousness posts on Facebook. These are usually, I think this is a conversation with one of his aunts. It just, again, back to, this seems like a family that is messy.
Yeah, it's super fucking messy.
It just seems like there's I couldn't find it, but I feel like someone else had posted a screenshot that was from like one of Buffy's like sisters or a sister-in-law or like a cousin or something, that was to the effect of like watching a documentary about her and being like, yeah, it was like really cool to see. I just wish that like the real story could be there. Like that it didn't have to be this like I was adopted stuff. I wish that like, and this thing of, you know, like in another post, him talking about that her mom and her grandma like bought her that guitar and like were really proud of her and really encouraged her songwriting. And so I think there is an element to this sort of family that felt left behind and felt erased, right? And that at the end of the day, it was like, we love her, but we hate that like we don't get to, have her. Like,
we don't get to rejoice.
We don't get to get our flowers, or our grandparents don't get to get their flowers, that like that they really supported her and made her career possible. That mom went and took out the loan so she could go to Amherst, and that like mom and grandma bought her the guitar and taught her the things and encouraged her so that she could have all of this stuff,
It's almost like the sacrifices that our family made for you simply weren't enough. Like, as real as they were, that wasn't as marketable. And that can be really hurtful.
Yeah.
Like, the real story wasn't cool enough to share amongst your friends, amongst
like we weren't
whomever.
Yeah, like we weren't good enough. We weren't enough.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be something that reaches the press and the media. It can be something very personal. It can be as simple as, okay, well, you are incredibly unpresent for your family at home, but when we go to these events, all you can talk about is what a great parent you are and what a great partner you are, but you don't do that. So I really wish that you would give me what you claim to.
Right.
I really wish that the story you told, if it were true, I would have showed up for you in a way that I didn't, because it didn't happen. And I would have been there. Like, if that were true as your sibling, parent, friend, partner, etc., were that the truth, my role in that would have been different.
Yeah.
But since that's not true, the way you're talking about me is also not true. I get that.
This makes me view the brothers' letter writing campaign differently, because it makes me go like, okay, maybe that letter writing campaign was about protecting his parents and like wanting his parents to, get the shine that they deserved,
right,
for,
or at least not be maligned. I mean, and I see this also in his daughter in that documentary. I have no doubt that in her heart of hearts, her dad is absolutely a victim of her aunt.
Yeah.
And yet, that is enough for a family discourse. That's not enough for an international dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I like, again, it's like, I think the inclusion of the child molester letter and story, it like, one, it did a disservice to this. Like, I get it. 'Cause she's publicly, after my dad died, she publicly said this stuff about him. And like, I just want people to know, or like have all the information.
Yeah.
I have empathy for that, I do.
Yeah. And absolutely.
I have empathy for that, for sure. And that's the thing is Buffy did publicly, call out her brother like after he passed. And so I pull back my previous statement about like, if she's going to go in public, it's like, she is, it's right of response. She is responding to public allegations that like she had threatened in the letter. And then after he passed, she did publicly, allege that he
should follow through on.
Yeah. And it's such a red herring in kind of what this investigation is about. I would have much rather that the documentary came out and that was not in it, and that in like a separate statement or like a separate interview, she was able to state her case. Like I just feel like they should have not been put in the same thing, because it's just like, it's too much.
And it doesn't bear,
and it doesn't really bear fruit. It's like, it's like the letter is not the smoking gun that they seem to think it is. It's like, like that still doesn't get us any closer to like truth or fabrication. Like it, because it's a he said, she said. So since the fallout from the broadcast of the Fifth Estate investigation into her identity and the documentary about her life winning an Oscar, She has made another statement, and it's long, so we'll both do this one. So I will start.
Okay.
So this is direct quote Buffy Sainte Marie's statement. I have never lied about my identity. The more I've known, the more I've pieced together a sense of self from what information has been available to me. What I know about my Indigenous ancestry, I learned from my growing up mother, who was of Mi'kmaq heritage, and my own research later in life. My mother told me that I was adopted and that I was Native, but there was no documentation as was common for Indigenous children at the time. When I grew up, I was adopted into a Cree family by Emil Pipot, son of Chief Pipot Treaty 4 Adhesion Signatory, and Clara Starblanket Pipot, daughter of Chief Starblanket Treaty 4 Signatory, in accordance with Cree law and customs. They were kind, loving, and proud to claim me as their own. I love my Pipot family, and I'm so lucky to have them in my life.
She continues, I have always struggled to answer questions about who I am. For decades, I tried to find my birth parents and information about my background. Through that research, what became clear and what I've always been honest about. I don't know where I'm from or who my birth parents are, which is why to be questioned in this way is painful, both for me and for my two families I love so dearly. My Indigenous identity is rooted in a deep connection to a community which has had a profound role in shaping my life and my work. For my entire life, I have championed Indigenous and Native American causes when nobody else would or had the platform to do so. I am proud to have been able to travel the world sharing Indigenous stories. I have always tried to bridge gaps between communities and educate people to live in love and kindness.
And she continues, this is my truth. And while there are many things I do not know, I have been proud to share my story as I know it throughout my life. The attack on my character is full of mistakes and omissions. While I will not stoop to respond to every false allegation, I feel it is important to clarify two things. First, the central proof used to question my identity is a story fabricated by my abuser and repeated by two members of my estranged family I don't even know. This has been incredibly re-traumatizing for me and unfair to all involved. It hurts me deeply to discover that my estranged family grew up scared of me and thinking these lies because of a letter I sent intended to protect me from further abuse from my brother. I want to be clear. I do not blame them. They, of course, want to believe their father. I have evidence I was sexually abused by my brother, but I can't tolerate discomforting his children even more. I wish them only the best and hope that they move forward from this and find peace as I am trying to do.
She continues. The second is my birth certificate. As many Indigenous people know, and the National 60s Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada has stated, it was common for birth certificates of Indian children to be created by Western governments after they were adopted or taken away from their families. So it was quite shocking to me to hear a city clerk say she had 100% confidence in its authenticity. I have never known if my birth certificate was real. I've used it because it was the only document I've had my whole life. I've heard from countless people with similar stories who do not know where they are from and feel victimized by these allegations and one-sided reporting as I do. Most importantly, this is my life. I am not a piece of paper. I am a product of both my families and all my experiences in this world.
And she concludes by saying, if you are a pure-blood documented something, I'm glad for you. It's awesome and beautiful to hear you speak your lineage, history, and genealogy. But even if your documentation says you're racially pure, you might miss the point. Being an Indian has little to do with sperm tracking and colonial record keeping. It has to do with community, culture, knowledge, teachings, who claims you, who you love, who loves you, and who is your family. With respect and love, Buffy Sainte Marie. What do you think?
Porque no los dos. Like, she is probably accurate to some degree, and I don't know how far, that it is more than what you can track in blood quantum and in the records. It's indigeneity and belonging to nations is more than the quantifiable terms that settlers have imposed upon those nations outside of their regard, outside of their society. And that can be true. And it can be true that being part of these communities is not about sperm count, sperm tracking.
It was kind of an interesting word choice there.
Yeah, it's really because now she's blaming her father.
Kinda. It just like I think
like sperm tracking. You're right, sperm tracking.
Yeah.
Like she could have said blood quantum, which would have really made sense and resonated. But sperm tracking is interesting. But no, I mean I get it, and I think that what she is saying speaks to a truth that is not her own.
Yes.
While those things are true, they are not her truth.
They're not her truth.
And exactly.
I bet she says, this is my truth. And that is actually kind of the most settler thing you can say. Dr. Kim Tallbear has a whole thing about that settlers, that our sense of identity is very personal. This is my lineage. I belong here. So, and that Native identity is about like relations and all your relations, community. It's very collectivist in its sense of
it's not about, it doesn't ever have to come down to your personal truth, because your personal truth is intertwined
with our truth.
Other people.
Like there's
and it's
And so I think there's so many tells just like within the writing that this is someone that sees the world in a very white way and so after releasing this statement, she quietly deleted all references to her being Cree from her website,
which says a lot.
So I wanted to end this with a TikTok by a Native creator that gave a really good kind of postmortem on the documentary and what it means.
Real quick, before we do that, can you tell us who this creator is?
The username is Yellow Horse Blackfoot with no vowels in yellow, and horse is HRSE Blackfoot. And of course, the TikTok and everything will be linked in the show notes, so you can find it and support this creator and give them some views and some likes. All right, we ready?
Okay. Ready.
All right, let's do it. Let's have a talk about Buffy. And disclaimer, if you have not seen the Fifth Estate story yet, please go watch it, because I am not interested in having some conversation degenerating into where you're trying to hurt me. Because that story was full of what I believe in, proof, documents and receipts about her identity. And trust me, I understand why you want to continue to support Buffy. I mean, she was one of my heroes too, and I actually was not going to watch that story, but I started seeing proof pop up on social media, so I decided to give it an honest look, and it really changed my mind. Because yes, Buffy was one of our icons. You know, she paved the way for Indigenous people for decades. Her music is incredible. Her work in the community is amazing. So I understand why you want to continue to support her. But let's talk about what else you are supporting while you're continuing to support Buffy. First of all, you are supporting an attack on the truth. And I've seen so many of you doing mental gymnastics trying to prove Buffy's story right. But honestly, birth certificates are not valid anymore. There's some kind of a conspiracy against Buffy. There's just too much evidence to the contrary. The truth is the truth. She is a white person, born to white people, raised in a white town, raised in a white way. Her family was very confused about hearing about that she was Indigenous, and they tried since the 60s to correct the stories through the media. Also, you are supporting this person taking up spaces meant for Indigenous people for decades. Even recently, in 2018, she won Indigenous Album of the Year. There were a lot of real Indigenous artists that she beat out for that award. And I read a very sad Facebook post of one of those people that was going against Buffy, who's now passed on from her sister. and how that losing that 2018 really sent her sister down a spiral, and she's gone now. And imagine all the activists, all the holy people, all the traditional people who could have been doing their thing, but Buffy was getting all the attention, pretending to be one of us. And you are also supporting Buffy throwing her family under the bus, throwing them away literally. I think about Buffy's mom, her poor mom, raised her all those years, put everything into her to give her a good life, only to have her, Buffy, go and make up a story about being adopted and being born in Canada. And her mother died with that hanging over her head. It's not very Indigenous. Try to respect our mothers. And you are also supporting, by continuing to support Buffy, the narrative that we cannot lead, that colonizers can kick us around, that we are worthless, that somebody else can be us. You're supporting that. Now, the one thing I did want to comment, and the thing that I see a lot of people talking about, is her adoption on the Pie Pot Reserve. Our Indigenous adoptions are absolutely valid and have nothing to do with blood quantum. Buffy is 100% from that family, from that reserve. She's been traditionally adopted. But they met Buffy when she was famous. Would that adoption have happened without Buffy's lies? You have to be honest with yourself about that. I know it's hard when an icon like this goes down, but we have great musicians. We have great professors. We have everything these people are trying to pretend to be. And those spaces are for us because we're valid. And we can no longer continue to support people who would take what is ours, especially someone who lied for over 60 years.
I mean, beautifully put. So
all right. Do you want to do the housekeeping?
Yes. Housekeeping. If you want to support us, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/illrepute. You get access to a Discord. We're working on that. You get show notes, you get the scripts, you get the uncensored video version of the podcast, and you get a bonus episode every month. There's a bonus episode up there right now. Links to all of our socials will be in the show notes. You can just click on that, and sources will be linked. This script was compiled by me, Sovereign Syre. Your hosts have been me, Sovereign, and Ella Darling, and it has been produced by Mr. Joshua Anderson. That is our episode.
Holy shit. And wait until next week when we have somebody else on.
Our first guest.
Ooh.
We're having
our first guest, who is I don't think we can live up.
No.
Sorry.
Leave it in.
Leave it in.
All right.
Austin's an allergen central. This was a great team.
Yes, it was.
You did great.
We did it.
And I can't wait until next week.
I'm so excited. All right. I love you.